By the start of 1963, Britain was already in the midst of some of the worst winter weather the country had faced in over 100 years. Between December and March, the snow completely buried the country, all the way from the north to the south. The English Channel was frozen, and many of the elderly froze to death. But despite that, the Beatles returned from their final appearance in Hamburg to a shocking factor. Their latest single, Please Please Me, had been released on the 11th of January, and they were already booked to appear on Thank Your Lucky Stars, one of ABC Television's highest-rated shows on Saturday nights. This was more or less down to music publisher Dick James. Brian Epstein had been disappointed with the way EMI had promoted the Beatles' first single, Love Me Do, so George Martin had recommended James to him, and after their first meeting, which resulted in James contacting the producer of Thank Your Lucky Stars right then and then after hearing Please Please Me, the pair created Northern Songs Limited with John Lennon and Paul McCartney, which would be a publishing company that would be responsible for releasing Lennon and McCartney's songs, with both John and Paul receiving 20% of the income, Epstein 10% and James 50%. George Harrison and Ringo Starr were also signed on as songwriters, but their percentage didn't even make it into the double digits. With everyone snowed into their houses, the Beatles' appearance on Thank Your Lucky Stars to promote Please Please Me propelled them into the public eye. Everything about them seemed alien and new, from their near-identical appearances, their bass guitar looking more like a violin and was being played left-handed, and how when they sang, they didn't scowl and rotate their bodies suggestively, but rather they smiled and bobbed up and down, all while the screaming of the fans filled the studio as the three guitarists' harmonies would often shift into a falsetto. George Martin's statement about Please Please Me being their first number one looked to be coming true as the song rocketed up the charts as the Beatles appeared on the Helen Shapiro package tour, as well as performing specially in Liverpool for Radio Luxembourg, and another appearance on Thank Your Lucky Stars, until finally it rested at number one on the 2nd of March. However, George Martin felt that the best way to capitalise on the success of Please Please Me while it was still popular was for the group to make their first album. Now, normally we're used to the idea of albums taking weeks or even months to complete before they hit the shelves or iTunes or Spotify or however songs are delivered nowadays. But for the Beatles' first album, it only took 13 hours from start to finish, and the album, also called Please Please Me, was rush-released on the 22nd of March, containing not only the 2 singles that had already been released and their B-sides, but also 4 other original songs, such as I Saw Her Standing There, Misery, Do You Want to Know a Secret, and There's a Place, with a selection of 6 covers from their days at the Cavern Club, ending with the showstopper Twist and Shout, a song which John Lennon literally shredded his voice in order to get right. In what would be traditional of Beatles albums, George and Ringo were allowed their moments to shine, with George singing the Lennon-McCartney penned Do You Want to Know a Secret, and doing his own cover of Chains by Jerry Goffin and Carole King, while Ringo performed Boys, a song originally sung by the popular girl group The Shirelles. The growing success of the Beatles opened up many gates for the north of England. Many London music publishers all rushed over to Liverpool and other places hoping to find their own staple group. But in front of it all was Brian Epstein and his company NEMS, which every day would be flooded with letters and presents for the Beatles as they soon became the leading music company for northern talent. These included Jerry and the Pacemakers, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, and Epstein's only female artist, Priscilla White, who had changed her name to that of Cilla Black, most of whom would get their start by covering songs written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. The business grew so much that Epstein decided to open a second NEMS office in London where he would do all his business negotiations for his acts. But none would be more important to him than the Beatles, who would do anything that Epstein told them to do as they found themselves being thrown around the country for various performances and interviews, and they would just sign any contracts that were given to them without even looking at them because, hey, Brian knows what he's doing, as they started work on their next single, which John and Paul had written during the Helen Shapiro tour called From Me to You, which didn't take long to reach number 1 after it was released on the 11th of April. However, the problem with this naivety of both the Beatles and, to an extent, Brian Epstein did lead to the problem of money. While the Beatles singles were making a lot of money and their numerous live appearances certainly added to that, they actually were receiving very little income from any of them. With all the deals Epstein had made to EMI and Parlophone, his association with Northern Songs Limited, merchandising rights, and now making a deal with United Artists for a 3-movie contract so that they could produce a soundtrack album in America, there were now so many fingers in the Beatles' pie all wanting to make a profit off these 4 boys that by the time it came to be paid, the Beatles could only get a fraction of what was being made and what their names meant as a brand. A few days before From Me to You hit number 1, John's son Julian was born, although John didn't see him until a week after his birth, and it was mainly to tell Cynthia that he was going to Spain for a holiday, and a red flag went up when John told her that it was just going to be him and Brian Epstein. Now, only Epstein's closest friends knew that he was homosexual, and since it was during a time when homosexuality was still illegal in Britain, it was made sure not to be leaked to the public. After all, it had been less than a year since Wilfred Bramble, the star of the successful sitcom Steptoe and Son, had been arrested for importuning in a gent's toilet. But everyone around Epstein knew that the whole reason he got involved with the Beatles was because he was harbouring feelings for John Lennon, and while on this holiday in Spain, John openly admitted that Brian Epstein did make sexual advances on him, but he turned them down. Although he later did say that a handjob was as far as they went. Whether this is true or not, John would always make snide jokes at Epstein's expenses, and Epstein was careful never to show that side of him again to the rest of the group. Eventually, the Beatles were the top billing act of their package tours, headlining Jerry and the Pacemakers and Roy Orbison, but the stress of doing everything for the Beatles was getting to their road manager, Neil Aspinall, from driving them to sorting their instruments out and arranging sleeping accommodations, and he was losing weight fast. So to make things easier, Epstein hired Mal Evans, a telephone engineer and occasional bouncer for the cavern, as an assistant roadie and, due to his size, occasional bodyguard. Mal Evans was already familiar with the Beatles. He once drove the group from Liverpool to London during the winter of '63, and after a stone had cracked the windscreen, Evans felt that the best thing to do was to punch the windscreen out completely so that he could see better. George Harrison would later joke about this, remarking on how close the Beatles were by the fact that all 4 of them would lie on top of each other to keep themselves warm from the blizzard that was coming through the broken windscreen. As many music publishers flooded Liverpool looking for the next Beatles, the most desperate were Decca, of which you may remember were the ones who had turned down the Beatles originally back in 1961 and were now trying to save their reputation. Fortunately, their saviour in this predicament was George Harrison. He pointed Dick Rose, one of the producers at Decca, in the direction of a former employer of NEMS called Andrew Oldham, who was the manager of an up-and-coming R&B group in London. So while they turned down the Beatles, Decca managed to redeem themselves by picking up the Rolling Stones. Now, popular media has always depicted the Beatles and the Rolling Stones as the biggest rivals in music history, when in fact the groups were really good friends. John admired their no-nonsense and rebelling attitude, as well as Brian Jones's ability to make music out of anything, while Mick Jagger and Keith Richards admired John and Paul for their ability to produce chart-topping songs. In fact, one of the Stones' earliest hits was a song given to them by John and Paul called I Wanna Be Your Man, which peaked at number 12 on the charts. The Beatles would later record their own version of I Wanna Be Your Man with Ringo on vocals. As they entered the summer, the Beatles were once again back in Abbey Road Studios to work on their 4th single called She Loves You, which was, for the time, an unusual song for a boy to sing, as it was written in the 3rd person and addressing someone else over their relationship struggles, and of course it went to number 1 on its release on the 23rd of August. They were also working on their second album, With the Beatles, which, like Please Please Me, contained 8 original songs and 6 covers. However, only 7 of those originals were Lennon-McCartney songs. George had started writing his own material, with the first song being called Don't Bother Me, and unlike Please Please Me, none of the original songs like It Won't Be Long or My Loving and Not a Second Chance would be released as singles. Soon enough, the Beatles caught the attention of Fleet Street and the papers when on the 11th of September they were voted as the most popular musical act in the country. Which may seem like small stuff to print, but remember, this was coming off of the infamous Profumo scandal, in which a high-ranking cabinet minister, as well as several other men, including a member of the Russian embassy in London, were embroiled in a huge sex scandal with the model Christine Keeler, an act which greatly damaged the reputation of the Conservative government and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, and also the Great Train Robbery, when £2.5 million was stolen from a mail train en route to Scotland, so really any kind of positive news at this stage was welcome. The press's opinion certainly changed after the Beatles made their appearance on Sunday night at the London Palladium, and they were soon engaged in interviews for some of the big newspapers, where their trademark cheeky charm was established, giving one-line quips to the most tedious of questions. But the reporters were more interested in their effect on teenage girls. While screaming for pop idols was nothing new, something about the Beatles just drove girls into overdrive. Uncontrollable sobbing, stuffing handkerchiefs into their mouths, and at the end of some concerts, a lingering smell of urine, as many girls had wet themselves during the performance. The newspapers would report on the riots outside the Palladium and also in Sweden, and then the Prince of Wales Theatre when the Beatles performed for the Royals at the Royal Command Variety performance on the 4th of November, in which John Lennon gave his now iconic remark of, "Would the people in the cheap seats clap your hands? And the rest of you if you can just rattle your jewellery," and dubbed the whole situation as Beatlemania. Certainly there was no stopping them when With the Beatles was released on the 22nd of November, knocking their first album off the #1 slot, and a few days later, the Beatles' 5th single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, once again was the #1 song for the Christmas period. But amidst all the numerous concerts, chart-topping singles and albums, rehearsing for their Christmas show, and recording a Christmas album for the Beatles fan club, the 4 boys wanted nothing more now than to retreat to their homes to get away from the madness. John and Cynthia rented a flat for them and Julian in Kensington, while George and Ringo shared a flat a few floors down from where Brian Epstein lived. Paul, however, had moved into the family home of his new girlfriend, a young actress called Jane Asher in Wimpole Street, and the pair of them could be seen wandering around the museums and theatres in London. Britain now belonged to the Beatles, but there was still one avenue they had yet to cross, which we'll talk about in the next part, the British invasion.